Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Career Discovery Sessions, where each week we speak to different individuals about their career paths and their places in the world. I hope this is helpful for you to find out more about your opportunities and where you can end up by taking different pathways. It's been super interesting to talk to so many individuals to find out about their success stories and about their values and morals. So, this week we have another individual who is the founding managing director of both School Dash Limited and Digital Science, both based in London. He is also an expert in online publishing, having worked at Nature magazine, The Economist, and McKinney's and Company, as well as many others. Please welcome Timo Hannay.
I'm Timo Hannay. My main day job at the moment is as founder of School Dash, which is a firm I set up 5 or 6 years ago to analyze education data. So it's in a way a technology company, but very focused on education and understanding education through use of data and analysis. But my sort of broader interests are sort of a combination of technology, particularly information and computing technology, and I suppose education and research, if I can sort of join those two things together. A lot of my career, but the early part of my career was spent running the online side of Nature Publishing Group. So Nature is a big scientific publisher. They publish a very well-known journal called Nature and lots of other journals, scientific journals besides. And in fact, I was a researcher. I was a neuroscientist back in the day. So I'm passionate about science and research and the accumulation and discovery of new knowledge, but I'm also passionate about the power of computers and the internet and information technology generally to sort of facilitate that kind of discovery and the dissemination of the results, right? So researchers themselves can use these technologies to help make discoveries more effectively, but then also we can use that to disseminate the results of that research to wider society more effectively as well. And so I was really lucky to be at Nature at a time when the web was sort of really becoming a thing. So this was, excuse me, particularly sort of, I joined Nature in the late 90s and ran their online business really through the 2000s, when it went from being like almost no part of their business. I mean, they started publishing full text online in about 97, so just before I arrived. And then the online part of sort of science publishing, scientific papers and so forth, really became a thing during the 2000s and ended up by the end of the 2000s with effectively most of their business. So most subscribers, most institutions, universities and so forth that were paying for access to their journals were doing so online. I mean, not only online, they were buying print issues as well, but online had become the main way of accessing this information by sort of 2010. So I'd been nothing to do with me, the bit of the business that I was responsible for, and went from being sort of 0% of the business to close to 100% of the business during that time. I then stopped doing that, and I created a spin-off business for them called Digital Science, which was focused again on using technology to help researchers, but much more around software and data. And I can tell you a bit more about that if you want to. And I ran that for the first 5.5 years or so. It went from being me in a room on my own to being several hundred people around the world. And it's still a very big and growing business. But I decided I want to do something different. And so what I do now is still data and software, but in the school education space rather than in the sort of university research space, if that makes sense. So yeah, my interests have been this combination of, scientific research and education, which is sort of, I see as sort of two aspects of an ongoing sort of spectrum between school education, university education, and then research. This is all part of, if you like, knowledge discovery and knowledge dissemination represented by the education system, but applying technology, particularly web technology, computers, data analysis, that kind of thing, to understanding and facilitating those processes. So it's always been that combination of sort of knowledge and education and information technology and computing.
Right. And obviously, like you said earlier, you joined Nature while it was simply starting out with its online boom, I suppose. Do you think you saw the grandiose change that was about to come over the internet? Did you see that coming, and how did that make you feel about being a part of this changing world?
Yeah, absolutely. I was incredibly excited by the opportunity, the potential of the internet and the web. I had been a computer geek in my teenage years, sort of in the 1980s. So I'm old, but I'd been a computer geek, and this was pre-internet. I mean, the internet existed, but the consumer internet did not exist at that time. Um, and so I'd been very keen on computers from a relatively young age, really from the beginnings of home computing in the sort of from the sort of early 80s onwards. I mean, the beginnings of home computing were arguably in the sort of late 70s or thereabouts, but around the late 70s, early 80s, and then I became sort of old enough to be interested in them, and we got a home computer, and so I've long been fascinated by computers and by how you can tell them to do stuff and they'll do it, and it's kind of, it's very empowering, and I was writing sort of games and things when I was a teenager for our home computer. I had with some friends, we had a very mini business selling some games to other people and things like that. But when the internet, then I sort of lost interest in computing for a while, partly because I was then doing my studies as an undergraduate in biochemistry, and then as a doctoral student in neuroscience. And then when I finished my doctorate, which was, I guess, 94, that was really just when the web was sort of starting to become a thing. And I worked a few years in business and in consulting, but then by the time I joined Nature, which was 98, the beginning of 98, I mean, the web had properly become a thing by then, and it was clearly full of potential. And yes, it seemed to me that there was massive potential for a business like Nature that was in the kind of scientific information business, right? This is going to radically reinvent what we meant by scientific information and how we could disseminate it and how we could make it useful and available to people. But even more importantly, this was going to revolutionize the way that research was conducted, right? This suddenly gave you new opportunities for accessing information, for collaborating with people, for tapping into expertise that, not necessarily in your institution. Researchers have long collaborated in a sort of global way, but this just made it so much more possible on a sort of everyday basis, right? You wouldn't have to travel to someone else's lab to work alongside them. You could do what we're doing now, right? You could collaborate remotely. So yes, it seemed to me that this was a huge opportunity, particularly for research itself, and in some ways would change the nature of research. And so I got very interested in the way that research itself would be altered by the existence of the web and other sort of information technologies. And we've seen that in all sorts of ways. The nature of research has definitely changed. I'm happy to talk about that. And so it was really again, a sort of stroke of luck. I sort of feel like Forrest Gump, this Tom Hanks character, who's just like, he doesn't do anything special, but he's always around. He's always around when really interesting things happen or really interesting people crop up. I sort of feel like there was a bit of that in my career, particularly at that stage, where there was just so much interesting stuff going on, and the nature of not only publishing but research itself was being reinvented to some degree, and it was great to be there at that time and to see it happening, and definitely right from the beginning it seemed to me like something interesting was happening here.
So you discussed the change in research. Where do you think it's going in the future from now on? How is it going to develop?
I mean, we're going to see some more of what has already been happening. So I think it's worth just sort of taking a step back and seeing like what happened at that time. So what we've seen is increasing amounts of collaboration, increasing amounts of sort of online at distance collaboration, increasing numbers of very, very large collaborative endeavors, and we're going to see that continue, I think. I mean, so you're going to see, more and more papers are going to have very long lists of authors. More and more research projects are going to be across institution, across function and speciality, across, country and continent as well. We're also seeing a sort of rise in the different kinds of outputs. So traditionally, the output of a researcher would be a research paper, These days, it's increasingly common for the outputs of research to be a data set, a database or something. If you think about the genome projects and those kinds of projects, right? The Human Genome Project back from the early 2000s, that reported in the early 2000s, but other genomics and lots of other similar kinds of initiatives that are happening. The main output from that is a big data set, right? The main output of the Human Genome Project 20 years ago or so was a big database that had a sequence for a human genome, right? Now we have, probably millions of sequences of human genomes. It's become, much quicker and cheaper to sequence humans and other organisms, and we have massive databases now. So that kind of quote unquote research, the main output of that is not a paper. The main output is an enormous database that other people that can then use to do their own research or to ask their own questions. So we're seeing that as an increasing kind of output from science, just data that then other people can use and that's made globally available online. Also algorithms, so it's another really important aspect of research these days is not just the findings or not just the data, it's also the algorithms, the methods that you can then use to apply to the data to generate interesting results. So again, if we continue with the genomics example, just the algorithms that allow you to search for sequences or allow you to determine similarities between sequences from multiple sources, that kind of basic thing. People invented those are genuine research outputs. So we're seeing a sort of change in what the nature of research is and what the kind, what kinds of outputs, what kinds of contributions researchers make. They're not just discoveries that they write up in a paper. They're big, valuable data sets. They are, new algorithms or methods that they can use to make these kinds of discoveries. And of course, we see it not just in the virtual world. We see enormous global collaborations on physical infrastructure, like from space telescopes to particle accelerators and so forth. I do think, having said all of that, and I think we're going to see more and more of that. Having said all of that, I do think research also faces some really huge challenges in. So it's not like things are just going to get bigger and better. I think there are some really huge challenges in research as well. In particular, I think, so my view is that we need to rethink the way that research is selected for funding and how it's funded. There's too much research, in my view, that's sort of incremental and relatively predictable. And the process by which you apply for money to do research sort of lends itself to that. You have to say, these are experiments I'd like to do. This is why I'd like to do it. This is sort of the anticipated outcome. And therefore it's sort of that, and if you can give a convincing case as to why this might be a useful thing to do and why it might deliver some useful results, you're more likely to get the funding. And the trouble with that is it tends to support relatively predictable research, stuff that's incremental beyond where we are at the moment, rather than, I've just got this wild idea, it probably won't work out, but it might, give me some money to try it out, please. That's less likely to fly for understandable reasons, but I think we need to have a place for kind of real kind of wild idea research. And I think we need to probably take a little bit more of an approach in which we're funding individuals who we know are going to do useful, interesting stuff, as opposed to funding individual projects, right? Particular projects that they're going to do. And that's an approach often taken by private research institutions, so ones that are based on endowments from wealthy benefactors and so forth, who have more independence. But the taxpayer-funded research tends to take a very low-risk kind of approach in general, and a very sort of lowest common denominator type approach, which I think lends itself to more predictable and less exciting types of research, and tends to mitigate against people who are going to make big breakthroughs, possibly high risk, but if you fund like 100 of them, 5 or 10 of them will make really big contributions. The other may not do anything useful, but overall you're going to benefit from it. And we don't tend to have that kind of approach. So I think research is not only going to change in the use of technology, which it will. I hope it will also change in the way we perceive it, in the way it's administered, the way it's funded, and so forth. And I think we have to, in order to be able to answer the kinds of research questions that we do these days.
And you speak of research as this growing field, and obviously we want to inspire people to be doing these high risk research, because that's essentially what's going to improve us as a nation. What would you suggest to students who might want to continue on with research? What do you think their motivation should be, and where should they find this drive to keep going with research, rather than trying to find a day-to-day job per se?
Well, I worked in research and then left, so I'm probably the worst person to answer this question. But maybe, so I'm sort of one of these people who I'm really, really glad we have researchers, and I love learning about the stuff they've discovered and benefiting obviously from those discoveries, as we all do ultimately. But I think, I worked I did a doctorate in neurophysiology in Oxford back in the day, and then did a year of postdoctoral research in Japan, actually. So I lived in Japan for several years, and 1 year of that was spent as a researcher at a university in Tokyo, doing research into the way that, the connections between nerve cells work in the brain. And I think the thing you have to recognize about research is that when you do it, and this is going to sound like not encouraging people into research, but I'm going to come on to the more positive aspects, is research is really hard, right? It's really hard work, and it's really sort of thankless in the sense of, you spend 90% of your time doing, at least I did, doing experiments that don't work, that don't yield any useful data. And if you read the kind of the biographies of, famous scientists, so Marie Curie would be a very good example, right? Who had such an incredible work ethic, right? You realize that actually it takes a huge amount of persistence and determination and patience and, just sheer hard work to get this stuff to yield any kinds of useful results, right? I mean, to look at it one way, if it was easy to make these discoveries, then people have already made them, right? So these things are like intrinsically quite hard. It's discovering new stuff is intrinsically hard, and it's literally hard work as well as being intellectually kind of challenging. That said, when you discover something new, right, that you didn't understand before, and perhaps no one's ever understood before, it's an unbelievably rewarding experience. And actually, it's one of the things I like about what I do now, which is more around data. It is research, but it's sort of data-driven research, particularly around the education system. And just this light bulb moment where this thing switches on your head, and suddenly you understand something that you didn't understand before, and then you desperately want to share it with other people, is a wonderful feeling of sort of elation. So I think I don't think research is for everyone. I wouldn't encourage everyone to research, but I think if you've got a passion for a particular field, obviously it's important to be interested in the object of study. So maybe you're interested in, quasars out in the universe, or maybe you're interested, as I was, in the mammalian brain and how that works. But there are all sorts of interesting things. I mean, basically everything in the world is interesting if you look at it in the right way. And so find something that you're just like obsessively interested in, that like so interested in that you can't leave it alone. Find some people who are doing, work that you consider to be good and interesting. Whatever the rest of the world thinks about it, stuff that you think is intrinsically interesting, work with them on it, learn from the way they're doing it, and persist. In my experience, the good days more than made up for the bad days, but there are quite a lot of bad days. It's not, you can't present research as suddenly, it's this, you can just kind of, potter around doing experiments and doing what you want. And once a week you'll make a new discovery and it'll feel really good. It's just, it's much harder and much more hit and miss than that. And everyone has, even the most successful researchers have low points in which they think they're not making any progress. But yeah, it's like, it seems to me that as a mission, there's nothing more important to humanity than creating new knowledge, right? Stuff that no one has ever understood before. And then once you discover it, hopefully that stands for all time, right? That's a new discovery that will then stand. It will be, it will be intellectually enriching, and in many cases, ultimately economically enriching to the whole of humanity. So it's one of these things where I think looked at in the right way can be incredibly rewarding, but the day-to-day of it is hard work. That's the reality.
Well, speaking about uncovering new things and sharing it with the world, I'd also like to ask you about your startups. So, of course, you have many on your list of achievements. Can you speak to us a little about how you decided to, start this new project and make it into a big boom, and what you'd suggest to students who want to start up their own projects as well?
Yeah, so I mean, I've effectively set up two businesses. The first was Digital Science, which was this spin-off from Nature, this software business that serves researchers primarily. And the second is what I'm doing now, which is School Dash, that works in the sort of the school education system. And they were done in very, very different ways. So maybe I can briefly describe how each of those were done, because they sort of take different approaches to entrepreneurship. So Digital Science was set up within a larger company. So it was a sort of sister organization to Nature. Our parent organization at that time was Macmillan Publishers. It's since merged with another big publishing group, and they've got a different name now. But at that time, it was Macmillan Publishers, which owned Nature, and we set up Digital Science as a business alongside that. So I was creating a new business, but it was within the bounds of a much larger, very well established publishing company, effectively. So at some level, it wasn't a kind of highly risky thing to do. I mean, I was sort of risking my career and my position at Macmillan, but Macmillan wasn't going to go bust as a result of this. We weren't spending that much money. But it was something new that we were trying to set up within this larger organization. And the way we did it actually was to work with entrepreneurs very largely. So what we did was we looked in our domain, which was basically who's doing interesting stuff with software and data to benefit researchers. And that might be, web-based software for managing your lab or ensuring lab safety. It might be services for tracking the online attention being paid to research coming out of a particular university, right? The university wants to keep track of what's appeared in the news, what are people blogging about, what are people on social media saying about our research, and how much are they talking about it, right? It might be tools for enabling researchers to publish and share data sets, all sorts of different things. So one can imagine. And we decided very early on that there were loads and loads of people doing interesting stuff in all of those areas. And we'd much rather work with them than compete against them. So what we did was we got to know these entrepreneurs who are often researchers who just had a kind of like, they'd noticed there was a thing missing from the toolkit that they had, and they decided to create it themselves or work with someone to create it. And we invested in those businesses, and ultimately we bought out some of those businesses, and the founders became employees, and people within Digital Science. So that's one way of looking at it, is to say, like, you can build a business by working with lots of individuals who have interesting ideas, and then supporting them with money, but also with, help, selling to universities, or, branding their product, or hiring a team and building up a kind of an organization, because most of the people we work with didn't have experience of doing that before. So that was one, that was a sort of top-down way, if you like, of within a larger organization building this new thing. But now with School Dash, so I did that for 5.5 years. We grew very quickly. It was very successful. But in a way, I wanted to be one of the entrepreneurs, right? I didn't just want to be the guy, like, as it were, the conductor of the orchestra. I wanted to actually play, right? And I wanted to do my own thing. So I then left and set up School Dash, which is in a different domain. This is now in what's sometimes called K-12 education, school education, but still around data and software. And what we're trying to do is help people understand the education system, particularly in England. So in the UK, education is sort of devolved. The different home nations have their own education systems. And in England, where I'm based in London, there's an enormous amount of data made available by the government and by other organizations about the school system. But I felt that it wasn't being adequately used, right, to help people really understand what's going on. And by people, I mean everything from like parents like me, I have 3 daughters. And so I'm sort of interested in schools as a geek dad, but also just, companies or organizations that engage with the school system, publishers who sell textbooks and other learning resources into schools, academic societies and charities who have programs around, education policy and trying to correct disparities, whether they're kind of to do with poverty or to do with gender or whatever else it might be. and there were all these organizations working with the school system who I felt could learn a lot about the system they're working with in the individual schools by better use of the data that was available. But it was being pumped out by the government, but not very widely or well used in my view. And to be honest, the way I came about it was completely random. And, the local primary school asked me to help them with some data analysis when I was still in my previous job running digital science. And I became aware that all this data was out there. It was really interesting. And and as a sort of geek dad, I was very interested from my own perspective as to what it could tell me as a parent about the school system and about our local schools and how they compared with other schools. So when I stopped doing digital science, I thought, this would be an interesting thing to work on, right? So the first thing was that I just found something that just to me was just incredibly interesting. And I wasn't quite sure where it was going to go, whether it was a business, and let alone how to build it into a business. But I did some analysis. Within the first few weeks, actually, was working with the media who covered some of our early analysis. And then that led to people contacting us saying, could you do some analysis for us as well? We've seen your kind of, your maps of education on, BBC News, or we've seen it on, on various other people that have covered our work. And, could you help us do some analysis as well? So it sort of quickly snowballed into going from, oh, this is really interesting, to, oh, here's some analysis we can do, to people talking about it, to then people asking us to do analysis for them. To be honest, if that hadn't happened, I probably would have, given up after a couple of months and we'd moved on to something else. But for me, the important thing was to find something I was really interested in, to try and identify what was missing from what people were currently doing in that area, and then try and fill those gaps. And for us, it was around, making use of the publicly available data in really meaningful ways, and doing really compelling visualizations of that data that people could, that they could play around with, interact with, and that would really tell them something that they didn't already know. And then you have to be adaptable, right? I really wanted to build a business that would help to inform parents, but the immediate opportunity was not that. The immediate opportunity was to help, companies that were selling into schools, or charities or academic societies that had policy initiatives to do with schools. And really, for the first 4 or 5 years, that was pretty much our entire focus. Now we started to move into some stuff that's more targeted towards parents, which is sort of what was my original aim. But you have to, when you're a young business, you have to kind of go where the money is and find people who are going to pay you. And at the beginning, it was hard to get parents to pay us. So we had to take a bit of a detour, which has been incredibly interesting and fulfilling in its own way, but was a bit unexpected. So for me, it was about finding something I was really passionate about, identifying a gap, but then also just being very flexible in terms of how we develop the business based on the opportunities in front of us.
Great. And do you have any final advice for any students who might want to go into finding their part of the market that isn't fulfilled, or starting up a new business and doing research or
So I think, for me, the important thing is always to find something you're really passionate about. And as I said, I think almost everything in the world is intrinsically interesting if you look at it in the right way. So there's no right or wrong about what is genuinely interesting and what isn't. It's about what captures your attention and your imagination. So I think to be widely curious, right? To go and ask about lots of things, read on lots of things, be open-minded about things, is incredibly important. And then just find the stuff that to you is just so interesting you can't let it go, right? I think it's and for everyone that's a different thing, right? For me, originally it was the brain. That was something that I felt like was so interesting I couldn't not study it, and that's why I became a researcher. But the things I've worked in as sort of professionally through most of my career have been things that relate to the opportunities offered by information technology one way or another, by computers, but not doing computing for its own sake, by applying it to the domains of research and education that really interest me. So I think finding that sort of where's the overlap of the things that really interest you, that you can be passionate about, and follow those passions and find, I think talking, obviously it's hard now during lockdown, but hopefully things are easing up. But doing the kind of thing you're doing, which is talking with lots of people about their own experiences, I think helps to broaden your mind. I think one of the challenges when you're at school, and particularly when we're under lockdown, is, you're as a young person, you're kind of exposed to a relatively narrow slice of the world, right? I mean, you know the subjects you're doing at school and your teachers at school, you know your family, you probably your perspective on professional life, you know, careers and professions is probably going to be shaped very largely by what your parents do or other people who are close to you. And I think it's really important to try and get as broad a perspective as possible. So, you know, consult widely, read widely, you know, try and take every opportunity you can to speak with people who, you know, about what they do and about why they do it and how they got into it. And that might be something like you're doing here, kind of an organized initiative, but often it's going to be just asking friends of your parents about what they do, you know, or just be curious, right? And then, you know, when you found something that you're really passionate about, just go for it. You know, I mean, and these things are serendipitous, so they're not things you can necessarily plan in advance. And there are probably any number of different things one might stumble into. I could have done something completely different, but fortunately I found something I'm passionate about. I'm sure I could have been passionate about other things, but finding something you're passionate about and then going for it. And I wouldn't worry too much. So my personal philosophy is I think I wouldn't worry too much around, you know, kind of, especially when you're still at school, around exactly what career track you're going to follow. I mean, I've already had about 3 different careers, perhaps 4, depending on how you count them. And I think people who are young today are going to have more than I've had on average. So being flexible, being widely curious and being enthusiastic about what you do is much more important than having particular expertise in a particular area. There are exceptions. Like if you want to be a doctor, you have to study medicine, right? So don't get me wrong. It's like I'm all for professional expertise, but I don't think one should be hung up about, oh, you know, what should my A-level choices be and how will they limit my future? I think your future is only limited by your enthusiasm and sort of willingness to grasp opportunities, and that's much more important. And having an open mind and taking every opportunity to engage with people who've had different experiences is the way to go, it seems to me.
Thank you. That is a wonderful thing to end on. Thank you for attending today's career discovery session.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Thank you for attending today's career discovery session with Timo and Hannay. I hope you learned something about research and entrepreneurship and how by having a personal interest to a subject and finding a gap in the market, you're able to succeed. See you next week on Career Discovery Sessions. Bye.